God's will is something we all want to know about, especially in a society which is void of identity, but labeled by designer brands and bankrupt of any substance. See, there are various phrases to describe God's will, but the most common are a sovereign will and preceptive will, and the will of disposition. Now, first is God's unknowable, sovereign and commanding will. Now, this aspect of God's will arises from the fact that God ultimately controls all events and outcomes. This means that God is in charge and nothing happens unless He wills it. So God works out in accordance with His plan and His will. And as Job in Job chapter 42 verse 2 states, I am confident in your abilities to carry out any plan you set your mind to. God's will can never be thwarted because He is all powerful. Things happen according to God's will. This understanding of God's sovereignty does not imply that God is ultimately accountable for everything that occurs. Sin is not something He causes. Instead, this viewpoint holds that all events occur with God's permission or passive approval because He is ultimately in control. So there is no situation in which He cannot intervene and make things right. So when God allows something to happen, He wants it to happen. So while God's ultimate will is sometimes hidden from us, unless it is manifested, we do have access to God's preceptive pertaining to the precepts or revealed will. In other words, this aspect of God's will is concerned with the specifics of His plan, and He has chosen which to make public. So God's instructions about what we should and shouldn't do or should not take part in are already illuminated in His will. And we know that God's will includes not to steal, loving one's enemies, and seeking forgiveness for one's sin. All people have God's moral code written on their hearts as evidences both by His word and their own inner recognition of right and wrong. So both scripture and the conviction of our hearts reveals God's will, which we must obey. So while we have the ability, we do not have the right to violate God's commands. Now, as a result, we have no room to make excuses for sin or argue that our wrongdoings is justified because it is in accordance to God's will. See, Judas did what God sovereignly wanted him to do when he betrayed Christ, but he went against God's revealed will. So despite the fact that his treachery was predicted, Judas' betrayal was heinous, and Judas's wrongdoing cannot be justified on the grounds that Jesus had to die and in order to save us, because He is still responsible for it. So even when God allows sin out of His own free will, it remains our responsibility. So the third aspect, God's will, is God's disposition. In terms of God's attitude, this aspect of His will specifies what pleases Him. Now, if we look at Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 23, we can see that God is not pleased when the wicked die. But we can also see that their deaths are His will or decree. So the assertion that God does not take pleasure in the deaths of the wicked demonstrates God's disposition. Another example can be found in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 4. As stated in the passage, God's ultimate goal is for all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. So given His infinite mercy and grace and love, God is inclined to save everyone. However, we are aware that no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. John chapter 6, verse 44. So God likes the idea of saving everyone, but the desire to demonstrate His majesty, justice, holiness, and kindness is greater. And so He chooses to save some while allowing others to perish. So if we are not careful, we may develop an unhealthy obsession with discovering God's will, looking into places that we shouldn't be looking. And what we must do is understand God's preceptive, revealed will, knowing that doing God's will as outlined in Scripture is true litmus test for us and for our spirituality. His example has set the bar for the rest of us to follow. So rather than assuming what God has unspoken and is not his intentions, we should simply obey what he has already made clear to us. Our spiritual acts of worship, according to Romans chapter 12, verses 1 to 2, are our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable and pleasing to God. Renew our thinking and live in a way that is diametrically opposed to this world. And how we do it is a counterculture. You know that in all these circumstances, in all our seeking God, in finding out what is his will for us, would be if our minds are renewed, not conformed to this world, but transformed, we'll find out the good and acceptable and perfect will of God for us. But we'll all come to the one point that everyone comes to, is at the Garden of Gethsemane, where we need to make that prayer for ourselves. Father, not my will, but your will be done.